So I've been discussing in this series of recordings and narrations my performance work over the decades, and I've divided that work into various categories. And I've suggested that those categories move in interesting ways or confusing ways, if you prefer, across one another. And these categories include collections, sortings, displacements, acts, gatherings, performatives, and perhaps recollections of what I'm doing now. I haven't talked about the importance, the value of metaphor in my work, but I want to do that in this particular installment. And I don't know whether this is going to be an example of a displacement, an act, a sorting, or a collection, because I have a lot of different things in mind, and I want to introduce this theater that I haven't really talked about very much at all, but I've referenced a few times in the course of discussing other theaters. But there's a part of the theater that I call space-time travel experiments, and space-time travel experiments results from a lot of different things. Psychologically, it's related to the idea of the fugue, the psychological fugue, a moment, a gap in everyday memory in which the experience of the conscious subject is in some sense lost and isolated, a kind of betwixt and between of consciousness. The psychological concept of dissociation is another one. It plays off of certain tropes and figures in Freud and the dream work as well. So it becomes part of memory, and it becomes part of the discourse, the 20th century and 21st century discourses on memory. There are two English translations that I know of Marcel Proust. One is Remembrance of Things Past, and one is In Search of Lost Time. So in this latter, In Search of Lost Time, the play of time as something that one can recover and navigate in a certain sense. And there are all these interesting things in the Proust, like these two different paths, Swann's Way and the Gourmand's Way, and then so this interesting field or space or world of the mind that one navigates through time, and there are various ways that this is done, and then science fiction comes into this and other kinds of play, but already you can see that the notion of space-time travel depends on this idea of metaphor, of movement and through space and time. One of my early pieces that hadn't configured time travel yet, but that was an early model that I had for space travel, was an ad I did for this imaginary spacecraft adventure and travel service that I imagined using a form of space travel that the metaphor for this travel was of a cinematic film projector, and the vehicle would project the way that a movie camera projects an image. It would project itself and its contents, the passengers on board and whatever they brought with them, into the space beyond. So this was so that it could obviously do this at the speed of light, in the same way that a projector projects the image onto the screen at the speed of light, because what it is projecting is light. And that was the model for a space travel vehicle. And then that model of the cinematic projector became, along with some other accompanying metaphors, became one of the primary models for my space time travel, along with explorations of memory as well, in particular. But I had been discussing these categories in terms of their organization and the way that categories are embedded inside one another. And I wanted to sort of re-examine some of those categories today, and to talk about the way that through the vehicle of metaphor, that in a certain sense, any one of these categories, collections, displacements, acts, sortings, gatherings, performatives, recollections, could become a mirror image of another. And I want to do that first by examining this this performance that I gave in the last discussion of a kind of sorting, and I want to translate that into space-time travel and see where that goes. So what I had done, we're looking at the Wikipedia page on metaphor, and one of the examples is from Shakespeare's As You Like It. All the world's a stage, all the men and women merely players. I wouldn't say merely, but they have their exits and their entrances. And, I would only take issue with the fact that, I've taken issue with this before. I've discussed it in relationship to Alan Capro's work versus what I do. Because it's a stage, it doesn't mean that on that stage one only plays, right? One can perform work on a stage. So the stage also becomes a place of doing a kind of work and performativity that, Shakespeare sort of denies or ignores here, and for a specific purpose, because of its the context in which it's embedded in this particular play, As You Like It, and this contrastive set of binary oppositions that he establishes between the world and its mimetic representation, which we're computing. But like I said in my argument with Capro, my happenings were never really about play. They were always about work, and they were always about change, and they always had a dynamic that that engaged the social experience of the way that individuals are, for example, sorted, collected, displaced, etc., 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 and challenged those in terms of the authorities that exploit us and oppress us and perform, our positionalities upon us without allowing us to define ourselves. So, that having been said, let me slide down to what we did before. And so here, this I described as an example, these little connections, these lines between each of these segments of my work and another collection of the organization of this work I described as sortings. And so a piece that involved collecting could become embedded in a larger work of collecting, but it could also, exist under acts. If, say, like within the Nellie Bly-like performance piece that I did in Metropolitan Hospital, and to some extent, to lesser extent, in Bellevue Hospital, but also in Bellevue Hospital, say that within that performance piece that I kept a journal, and that journal took the poetic form of a list. Well, that would be a collection. That particular volume of poetry, that notebook of lists, would be a collection of words, and it would have existed under this category of acts, because I was performing and I was acting in this space, this theater. Say this is Bellevue. And then inside of Bellevue is a notebook. So here's the list, poem, notebook, that's a collection, and this space is the theater for acts. All right, so that gives you an example of what I was doing here, and and this whole process of organizing these concept areas, I was configuring as sortings. But it could also be configured as space-time travel, right? So and the sortings, in a certain way, could define one map and say, so we put a whole another set over here. A whole nother set of relations could define a space-time travel set. Or, this is a sort of and/or idea. If we want to impose the metaphor of space-time travel on sorting, we could say that all acts of sorting. Okay, so I had claimed that all testing, right, is sorting, right? So if you take the SAT test, you're being sorted between those individuals who this testing service deems have aptitude to succeed in college versus those who don't, right? So it's a sorting, and tests sort individuals. There are other ways of sorting, right? You sort objects in a collection. You can sort by types and typologies of insects, religions, whatever. So all of these are examples of sortings. But in a certain sense, if you want to impose the metaphor of space-time travel on sortings, you can say that all examples of sortings are examples of space-time travel. Because you're taking something, right, and you're organizing it, and in the organizing of it, you're moving it. And metaphor does this. Like every metaphor, in a sense, is an example of space-time travel. Now, and that's there in the etymology of the word itself, right? It means to carry or transfer or carry across. So it displaces, in some sense, some conceptual idea from somewhere to somewhere else. And that displacement or that transfer or that carrying like you would carry something over a troubled water, or you would carry something over an impassable domain. A fireman carries you from the fire if he's in the act of saving you from a burning building, right? So metaphor, right, and space-time travel have this interesting, relationship to one another. You could say, you can say that metaphor has a relationship to any conceptual fictive domain, perhaps, and but some domains lend themselves better to the idea of carrying, moving, voyaging. Invitation to a voyage, invitation to a journey, an opening, a door, passage, right, than others. So certain forms of narrating are journeys, certainly, and those perhaps, belong to this kind of a relationship more than others. But certain types of narrative are not. They involve sort of process of development. Now, process of development is certainly an interesting idea, but it's not inherently the substance or the root idea of metaphor of this moving or carrying thought as the way say one would carry a stone, or a being that one's rescuing from some place. So here is here's part of the etymology of metaphor, transference, and so it's interesting. So ownership comes up again, transference of ownership. Well, that's really interesting, to carry from something. So something belongs to something, and then it's moved somewhere else, and in the process of moving, ownership is challenged. Or you could say, okay, so in collections, right? So these things that Howard Carter disinterred from the earth, they belonged to the tomb of Tutankhamun. So they were Tutankhamun's, and they were part of his journey through the afterlife and that adventure. And he needed these things because in this symbolic journey, one needed supplies. So food and these material objects and magical charms and aspects of the soul, they were all part of ownership. And then when they're disinterred, then there's a transference of the ownership to these British archaeologists and anthropologists, Howard Carter, Lord Carnarvon, and others, and they're transferred to the British Museum, where they take on a totally different symbolic and metaphorical function, right? They become objects of the display of British Empire, an embodiment of the power of ownership itself. So all of like the ritual magic and the properties of sacredness and eternity that were part of the functionality of the original ownership are transferred into this sort of operation of the display of empire and the possession of these symbols of power in that domain, right? Okay, so metaphor had been really important for me early on. As I had mentioned, I was educated at University of California, San Diego, in arts, in linguistics, and to some extent in history. One of my teachers, Helen Harrison, of the Harrisons that did work with eco art and environmental art, for her, metaphor was the beginning of the way that art emerged. And you would start with this idea of what do you want to talk about, and then develop a list of metaphors of the ways that you could imagine talking about that. And then as this list of metaphors developed, you would pick and choose which ones seemed productive to the way that you wanted to explore art and this subject in art, and which metaphors that you thought were banal and trivial, and that didn't lend themselves to investigation and discovery. So these ideas grew out of the work of George Lakoff and Johnson, to some extent, and there had been a discourse in philosophy for some time about whether metaphor had cognitive significance or not. And I never understood this argument, because it seemed to me that metaphor is the most obviously full conceptual organizing structure for cognitive significance. That is, when a rock is just a rock, it doesn't mean, it doesn't speak, it doesn't lend itself to becoming an object of consciousness. It only becomes meaningful and a force. It becomes noema when it's metaphorized. And so only metaphor, it seemed to me, in some sense, had cognitive content. But that was my take. This is, again, from the metaphor page, and it uses this passage from Psalms. This is from the 144th Psalm, my favorite Psalm that I reference often. And the line is, the Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer, which is more or less a literal translation of the metaphor that exists in the Hebrew text, right? So if you go, if you go to the King James version of this text, the 144th Psalm, the translator unfortunately doesn't use the word rock, which is in the Hebrew, is literally used in the Hebrew, but uses the word strength. So in I.A. Richards' terms, right, he already does the work that the attendant to the tenor and the vehicle is supposed to perform in the act of cognitively managing the metaphor. So Richards sets up these two parts of metaphor where you have the tenor and the vehicle, and the vehicle is the rock. It's the thing that gets you to the tenor. The tenor is the idea that it's describing. So in the King James version, it says that the Lord is my strength. So it doesn't give you the vehicle; it gives you the tenor, and it's not a metaphor anymore, right? Because to get to the tenor via the vehicle, we're talking about movement, and I want to kind of remind everybody paying attention to what I'm doing that. Movement and space-time travel is something that we're investigating in the background of this background. So that unfortunate translation sort of erases the metaphor of the rock. The rock, is gone, and so the strength is the strength. The rock is the rock. But in that translation, then some of these other issues, the shield, which is another metaphor, right? And the horn, which is another metaphor, and even stronghold could be considered a metaphor. Those are present in the King James translation, but I've worked a lot with rock, and it's not an accident. It began with a work in collecting, and it began as a critique of this form of colonial collecting, and collecting involved in different applications of capitalism, and then it sort of emerged from that domain and took on other characteristics that have to do with speaking and language. And this idea of the language of stones that if one imagined being deprived of the ability to speak, and that one had access to material that one could speak, potentially with anything. And I liked the idea of speaking with stone. And there were a lot of reasons to choose stone, because Orpheus moved stone with his harp, because of this sonnet and the ability of a stone, both to represent strength and to really be a power, for David, who trains in the art of hurling stones. It becomes a power, and it becomes an ability that he has that transforms his life, right, from an ordinary shepherd boy into an adult king, worthy of his people via his ability to throw stone. So there were a lot of reasons why I wanted to bring, and then Roger Caillois has a text called, The Language of Stones, and he looks at these different patterns in rock, and he sees images in them. So this process of seeing these images that emerge, from the unconscious, or maybe not even the unconscious, because people seem to have agreement about some of these stones. They're so obviously representational of, say, a landscape in which individuals are standing beneath a cloudy sky, or other iconic imagery that we seem to agree upon. So these are, in some sense, Rorschach stones that Kaiwa talks about, and in some sense not. In some sense that they just play with this ambiguity again between what is representation and what is extant in the world. So to kind of bring us back to this, all the world's a stage. We just have to look for its significance. So returning to metaphor and space-time travel, and it's that particular set of works relationship to some of my projects. I had been talking about Harry Smith, the American filmmaker, and I don't want to say the author or even the producer of the American anthology of folk music, because a lot of individuals were involved in it. But the collector of the materials and the artist responsible for the conception of the anthology of American folk music. I had been talking about Harry Smith as a collector, and the ways that his collection of paper airplanes and other collections, bore similarities to my early collections, and ways in which they were different. And recently I had via one of my early teacher and professors' blogs, had learned of the passing of an artist named David Baptiste Chirot, who I had minimal contact with, but I had sent a couple of letters, based upon my interest in his work, and hints that some of the areas in what he was doing, were similar to what I had been working with. Now, Chirot is an interesting artist from this point of view of collecting as well, because a lot of his work bears upon the idea of collecting and lists. Now, some of that is collecting physical materials in the world, images, and objects that would become part of his collages and rubbings, and part of this large body of visual poetry that really kind of confuses the boundaries between poetics and visual arts. But other aspects of his work belong to this idea of lists and collections as well. And one of these aspects was his fascination with this individual artist, from roughly the same period as Baudelaire, or the symbolists, the late 1800s, early 1900s, and this particular artist, or poet, I suppose, Félix Fénéon, Chirot describes as a conceptual poet, early conceptual poet, and the rationale is that because he was a conceptual poet, because his poetry was based on these found objects, just like Chirot's, in many ways, or at least part of his work was based on these found objects, just like Harry Smith, found these paper airplanes, and that collecting became, a big part of, and anthologizing became a big part of his art. So Felice Fignon's work, here's an example. Here's a collection of found headlines. So, just read a few of these and then talk more about how this bears upon the idea of space-time travel. Nurse Elise Bachmann, whose day off was yesterday, put on a public display of insanity. A complaint was sworn by the Persian physician, and I don't know how to say this name, but Jai Khan, against a compatriot who had stolen from him a tiara. A dozen hawkers who had been announcing news of a non-existent anarchist bombing at the Madeleine had been arrested. A certain madwoman arrested downtown falsely claimed to be Nurse Elise Bachmann. The latter is perfectly sane. Now, I'm going to end there because, for a number of reasons, but mainly because two different explanations are provided for the events surrounding the character Elise Bachmann. In the first, she's described as having a day off and putting on a public display of insanity. Now, we're not really sure whether that is what kind of stage is that? All the world's a stage, and so is this public display her allowing herself to be who she is, or is it a mere performance? Is it an imitation of insanity, or is it insanity? We're not sure. And then this next one, a certain madwoman. So already the performative, the adjective acts as performativity there, right? A certain madwoman, certain, not questioned, right? So she's being labeled. There's an assertion there. She is insane. She was arrested downtown, falsely claimed, and then another claim is made that she in fact isn't what she says to be, that she's not a nurse, she's not Elise Bachmann. So there must be an Elise Bachmann, or one assumes, and that it's not this madwoman. And then here it clarifies the latter. So it clarifies that there is in fact an Elise Bachmann. Presumably she's a nurse, and another assertion is made, she's perfectly sane. And these are two different people, right? Okay, so there's two different descriptions of the same event. Now, that's not obviously bearing upon metaphor, but it's bearing upon this construct of event and conception that follows, right? So if you take the event as the actuality of the language, right, and the interpretation as the vehicle, then the resulting conceptual framework becomes the tenor, right? So certain ideas can be substituted one for another, but what becomes clear is that something has to happen to this event, some act of interpretation. The consciousness has to come to decisions about this event before it can turn into a meaning. Now, that meaning can either be meaning A, the first inscription in the Fignon, or it could be this meaning D, the fourth inscription, or it could be another one, right? We could come up with another interpretation, but the event, right, clearly has this structure. The fact that there are two interpretations suggest that in order to become meaning, it has to take on a metaphor-like quality. You can't just say there was a woman who may or may not have been a nurse, who may not have been had this name, whose day was on or off, and who either was insane or not, and that either someone saw this or didn't. You could say all of those things, but it wouldn't take on the characteristics of an event in the same way. It would remain in a hypothetical realm, and conceptual realm that doesn't belong to the materiality of ideas, right? That something could be ascribed to a certain space time, and that a meaning can be given to that time. So that's the first thing that, and why I wanted to stop there. I wanted to stop there because Elise Bachmann is the only individual in the rest of the remainder of the list in that Shiro presents of this particular text, at least. If the list is longer, perhaps one would find otherwise. But she's the only individual whose story is told twice, and whose story is told in such profoundly different ways that it opens up questions about the accuracy of any of these events and the way that they're constructed and the way that they're told. And, what, if from an artistic point of view, if these are events in the real world, what as metaphor do they mean, and what do they give rise to as conception, right? So in a sense that my narrating the work of my past could be taken as literal, but how empty would that be? It's as if one were to read the parables of Christ and say, oh, like that's an interesting story about a guy who got some money and buried it in the ground versus what these other guys did. No, they're all metaphors of the soul, right? They're metaphors of spiritual progress. They're metaphors of the soul. They're metaphors of right action. This is what makes them interesting. This is what gives them cognitive content, not because things happen in the world, but because we find meaning in them. So choosing her for that reason, and then choosing those two these two sets because it calls attention to the name. She claims to have this name, and does this name belong to this individual? This one is apparently described to one individual. The first set, there's nurse Elise Bachmann, right? And then in the second set you have this casting doubt. Perhaps there is Elise Bachmann, but perhaps she's not the same individual who claimed to be, and perhaps she's not the same woman who performed this madness. And in this one, what's interesting in terms of doubt is the first set is she mad, or is she merely putting on a public display of madness? And then in terms of the way that that image coming out of this list of events, that through metaphor, specifically these two mentions of this individual, for me is kind of transportive, or engaging in those activities of the mind, that phenomenology of mind that allows for a certain kind of space-time travel. So for me, this idea of an individual in 1906 or around that time performing a public display of insanity gives rise to a lot of questions, like why, and reminds me in many ways of work that I began looking at by Nellie Bly, and that in some sense was part of the inspiration for Acts to begin with. Now, I think I've mentioned Nellie Bly before, but probably not in any great description. But one of the things that she's famous for is journalistic work that she did and performed in what's referred to as 10 Days in a Madhouse, right? That she undertook as an investigation of the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island, now called Roosevelt Island, that individuals, following my description of my work will realize, that's where I performed a lot of the work that I engaged that had to do with the performativity of labeling individuals with terms designating madness, mental illness, and the way that these designated individuals, these performatively, or I'm not sure how one would say it, enacted, right, positionalities allowed for the justification for certain kinds of displacement in prisons, asylums, moving of individuals from these preferred spaces like Manhattan to other spaces. So her undercover assignment was to engage the activities of the asylum, the asylum on Blackwell's Island, by being admitted into the asylum as suffering from having performed an act and claimed, to be suffering from these sorts of behaviors that would have admitted her to this location and assigned her with this category of madness. And then she documents her experience there. One of the things that she doesn't document is how difficult it is once one gets oneself in one of these situations to get out of it again. I'll talk about that, when I talk further about my experiences in Metropolitan and Bellevue, but it's a stunning performance, and it serves the purpose, right? It's not just play. It's not just this Shakespearean all the world's a stage, so act it. It has a function, which is to report, like, these injustices and these certain ways of interpreting, right, behaviors and activities that become judged and become and having been judged, right, become the justifications for all kinds of intolerable oppression and exploitation, and how difficult it is to even talk about those things, because they're so shut away from our everyday experience and our ability to gain access to these materials. So that's another reason why I wanted to stop at those two words, or those two sections, and look at least Bachman, from this point of view of space-time travel, memory, metaphor, and other kinds of ways that my work has moved and transferred, carried one thing to another place, and the way that I see that working, or having worked, in the work of David Baptiste Chareau as well. And so let's begin with this word, the last part of at least Bachman's name, which is Bachman. So I thought of. I also thought of this individual because I've in some ways engaged her work as well. Ingeborg Bachmann. This, by the way, is just a search. This entire page that I'm on is just a search for the word, Bachmann. So I engaged Ingeborg Bachmann's work in a variety of ways, and recently did a video piece that begins with an image of Ingeborg Bachmann for a number of reasons, but all right. So let's look at some of the ways that having established this I'll call it this coordinate. Okay, so what we're doing right now is I'm using Bachmann that word as a coordinate for a space-time travel experience. And the reason that I'm justifying the use of that particular word is because Bachman has come up in my work via Ingeborg Bachman on a number of occasions, and because this Elsie Bachman reminds me very much of some issues involved in the work that I did that began with an understanding of Nellie Bly and her history and her motivations in this fascinating form of performance. So we started with an idea of collections, collecting these stories, things one finds versus stealing. Found this interesting connection with this Nellie Bly-like character, or potentially so. We don't know who Elsie Bachman really is, but the name itself gives rise to fascinating sets of speculation. So Bachman was the search term that I used, and then I want to make some more connections. So the first connection that I'll make is with myself. I happen to use Jerry Rothenberg's site as a kind of space-time portal. I had envisioned it that way, from the very outset, and had some of my work published there. So one set of space-time coordinate conjunctions will be whatever a space-time coordinate search term, right, can lead me to in relationship to a number of sets of investigations that I want to do. So here's the first published piece that I have, and then under the search term Bachman, we'll look at whatever intersects along these parallel lines. So I'll begin with the sentence. I won't interrupt the sentence. She returns with a pill bottle, swallows down a handful without water, then goes back to window, stands at angle of window, peering out at the street below. She lights a guiton or guitane, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, a cigarette, takes a few deep drags, closes her eyes, listens for a few moments, then walks over to the gramophone and lifts the arm of the record with a notable scratching sound. Okay, so this is a description of Ingeborg Bachman, and then the cigarette, refers to the way that she died. She was smoking a lot, and died in a house fire, probably caused by carelessness and smoking. She was depressed. This is an individual who had a relationship with Paul Celan. She was very much aware of the traumas of the Holocaust and post-Holocaust period. She was also a feminist and worked with issues of women's rights. So this is like this moment of addiction, right, and despair. It intersects the life of David Thoreau in interesting ways. He was also an individual who, in various ways, was either considered an insider or outsider, or belonging to both. There being a kind of ambiguity in the way that his work was, accepted from an artistic point of view by museums and galleries, and yet had this sort of outsider style existence in which the sufferings that he experienced in his life, he dealt with drugs and alcohol. He had gone through various recovery programs. I know that from very brief correspondence with him that he was in a lot of pain and had a lot of suffering related to spinal issues and problems with his health that he used to justify his use of pills, and that in his passing away, I don't know much about his recent passing away, but I imagine that it was related to this lifestyle and this. So some interesting kinds of parallelism there. And then the other thing with the fire is interesting because my piece here is all about fire. Remember that. So I'm using the term Bachmann as the input value for a kind of locus or coordinate for space-time travel experience. So this is all about fire, and then so we'll go back up to the same spot. Anyway, let's go back. All right, so let's using this term see if we can find David Charot. There he is. All right, so I'll begin with this sentence. A difficult bargain because the borders between those two are not always open or even porous. So we've been talking about space-time travel as like open door, invitation to voyage, different kinds of journey, the drunken boat, perhaps a difficult bargain because the borders between those two are not always open. Borders now, take on a particularly relevant significance because of so much contention around the border and the wall. Borders are any, conceptual organizing authority between, two separate or discrete entities. So Charot's sentence here seems to suggest that porous borders are always preferable, right? And I think in any kind of work where you're collecting is an acceptance of that invitation to journey, that one would need to have that openness. Okay, so where does it end? One last note before we begin. Any resemblance with persons who have actually existed in the past is due or can be attributed, if such attribution is necessary or desired, to my lack of imagination or to my dislike of fiction or to my desire not to make up what doesn't need to be made up. So all of these potential questionings, right? These are the same kind of options that we had with the character of Elsie Bachmann. Is she mad? Isn't she mad? Is she Elsie Bachmann? Is she a nurse? Is she not Elsie Bachmann? All of these potentials that open up with that question are opened up here. These are all rationales for why, right? Why any resemblance with persons who actually existed is due. That resemblance is not anything other than due to a lack of imagination. So the idea would be that the purely fictional that doesn't bear any relationship to something from the past is a function of the imagination's inability, right, to exceed the bounds of experience. It almost reminds me of Alan Capro's idea of performance art, that you need to make it so unlike theater that people won't confuse it with theater or drama, so unlike jazz, so unlike painting, so unlike this. It has to resemble nothing other than the happening, and this again is another part of Pierre Joris's description of these events in his little one-act play describing the last days of Ingeborg Bachmann. All right, let's see where else we can travel. See if I can find. Okay, here's another. Here's another David Baptiste Chirot entry, and it exists right between, or maybe it touches this last one, but as one of the 30 accused and tried for conspiracy in a much publicized trial, it is Fignon's severe mugshot that for a time presents his public face. So even this picture that we have of him that I was focusing on a bit in the outset is from a mugshot, right? So taken from, like collected from this public domain rather than being part of this like aesthetic production of one's self-portrait, not an artist rendering, but like more from the socio-political domain of enforced law and public imagery. So very much out of like this kind of newspaper and public imagination. The severe mug facing the viewer is actually producing a conceptual poetry at a distance. Well, I totally understand what he's saying, because when he refers to conceptual poetry, he's not really referring to metaphor so much as he's referring to found as opposed to created objects, right? As opposed to crafted objects. So that finding is conceptual. What makes it conceptual is the same thing that makes Marcel Duchamp's urinal conceptual. It's the performativity of saying this is poetry, or this found thing is painting, or this list of newspaper headlines is a collection of lines and phrases in an ongoing narrative event poetry. And it's conceptual because it's the mind that applies the concept of an aesthetic category. So for Duchamp, it's sculpture. I found this thing, and then through the concept that I performatively labeled it, it becomes a work of art. And that's conceptual as opposed to creative, right? And so this is the sense that he has. So the severe mug facing the viewer is actually producing a conceptual poetry at a distance, not penning a single line, by simply facing the music to which others pen the lyrics. Fignon, in doing nothing more than facing the camera, capturing his image, proceeds to enact a series of dramas projected onto him, a series of identities and revelations which use the documentary material to produce a series of mass publicized fiction. So, very much like the idea that we began with under metaphor, right? What Chirot is claiming is that Fignon's image is a kind of theater, and it's a theater that in which he acts by allowing the performativity of the gesture of others to work its magic upon him, and merely addresses the audience with the performativity of that feature. In some ways, like in that way, it isn't that different from what Nellie Bly encountered in her performance, was that she did begin with a kind of mimesis, presumably, of certain kinds of states of mind and actions. But once begun, then the performativity of her judges takes over, and she's labeled a madwoman. She's moved, she's transported via this performative metaphor of madness to a different location. In that setting, she becomes an actress in a much larger and more dramatic theater than one can probably even imagine. And then the performativity takes on a life of its own, in which she has to escape, those terms performed upon her, mad, lunatic, etc., re-engage herself as the non-fictional character who writes articles. Another one of her names, Elizabeth Cochran Seaman, the name that she was born with, she has to return to claim and identify herself as before she can publish the results of her experiment in this theater of madness, or this, that in many ways shares a lot of characteristics of our space-time travel theater. So so I totally get that. What Shiro is referring to by simply facing the music, right? So to which others pen the lyrics, right? So all say we go back to the Duchamp and the urinal. Duchamp, that urinal, like as say that in some ways it's a direct address. It's a face. It's a portrait. It's a portrait. It's a head. Say that it is, and it stares back at the viewer, and it stares back at the art critic, and whatever that art critic projects onto the urinal, whatever offense that art critic has, whatever insult that he provides to it, it comes from the theater and the space of the imagination of those musics that it simply faces, right? And the musics are all of the ways in which those figures in the social construct project onto the identity of that particular actor, that particular urinal as actor in this theater, a series of identities as either clean or unclean, or modern, or offensive, or useful, or aesthetic, or shiny, or whatever it is, And so if you're Aldous Huxley, you're gonna make different kinds of projections than if you're Tristan Tzara. But if you're a psychoanalyst, you're gonna make different kinds of projections than you would if you were certain kind of Marxist, right? So all of that is going on there, and again, very much reminding me of Nellie Bly in my in this particular space-time travel experience. Okay, so here's another one. Obviously, David Shiro figures in this space-time travel theater that I'm using here quite often, and so any coordinate that one plugs in is going to give rise to some results. So here, we'll read this sentence from the beginning. This publicized facing camera and viewer and possible hard time is taken to be the photo of the face of a being from whom the mask of the clandestine and conspiratorial have been torn off, revealing the whole cold hard truth of Felix Fignon. Facing trial, however, all that is learned of the imprisoned face is that it is the wrong man, an innocent man. Well, that's interesting. So once again, and we began with this, is this her or is this her? So this question of indecidability of whether this individual is acting, pretending to be mad, whether this individual is acting, pretending to be the nurse Elise Bachman, or is she the nurse Elise Bachman? Is she a mad person? Is she what kind of theater is this? Here, coming back to social political significance, is this idea that fate hangs in the balance of this decision between wrong and correctly identified and incorrectly identified. The wrong man, an innocent man. Is this the man? And we haven't looked at what the charges are or any of that. And in a way, I'm not interested. I'm interested in this what this space-time travel experiment gives rise to in terms of some of the questions that it originated from. And it originated from questions involving what do we know about an event before we interpret it? And what does it mean? Does it have cognitive content? What is truth's relationship to fact? What is meaning's relationship to matter? What is metaphor's relationship to meaning? So these questions emerge in concentric circles of our understanding as we perform this space-time travel experiment with this coordinate Bachman, and that we do so under the aegis of David Baptiste Chiraut, because he's our guide in this particular experiment. Let's see if I can find anything else here. Well, it would be interesting if we can locate, we may or may not be able to locate Ingeborg Bachmann's entry. I don't seem to be able to do that. Well, here's another one of mine. Okay. So, the cover of this particular literary journal and perhaps the title that goes along with it, Translation Without Limits and the Limits of Translation. I would translate, in this instance, I would translate translation into metaphor, or perhaps space-time travel itself, or perhaps translation of the space-time travel coordinate, Bachman, and the limits of the translation of that from one Bachman to another. So, thinking about that gives rise to another idea, which is that that any word is also a collection of all of the objects that falls within the domain of that word. So that our space-time travel coordinate Bachman, we can make a list of Bachmans, and that would be a collection of Bachmans. So far, we only have two. We have Elise and we have Ingeborg. And I wanted to find another Chiraut, but I don't seem to be able to. Well, there's Chiraut here. So, all right, here is another reference to Chiraut. So this gives rise to another set of coordinates here. I have practiced translation in one form or another for more than 50 years now. My first publication book was, in fact, New Young German Poets in 1959. Okay, so this is Jerry Rothenberg narrating the fact that Ingeborg Bachmann is one of the poets, one of the new German poets that he published in translation. In the first, his first published, as far as I know, his first published work of poetry, yeah, it says here, my first published book, in fact, in 1959. So a kind of origin, right? So So Bachman takes us back to, for Jerry, takes us back to this origin as well. And this new young German poets in 1959 was Jerry's, first book of poetry, his first collection of published poetry, and first collection, first anthology. And as individuals familiar with Jerome Rothenberg's work will know, anthologies is one of the major ways that he has worked over the course of his writing and his collecting of poetics. You could consider this particular blog an example of an anthology that isn't limited, simply by we usually consider an anthology something like a collection that's informed, as I said before, by a kind of unity, whether that's thematic, historical, a matter of identity and positionality of the subjects in the anthology. But for this particular anthology, it's more like an anthology of anthologies that we're looking at for the source of this space-time travel experience. And it's interesting that here, Shiro, who's just passed, brings us back to this originating moment, or this moment of genesis in this exploration of anthologies. So there are probably more, and I could work more, but this is just one example of a kind of space-time travel. You could say, you can call it metaphor, or you could call it a conceptual organizing principle, but what it allows us to do here is explore a set of semantic and narrative values that bring a number of different positions together, and that carry meaning from one place to another, so that the carrying of this meaning from this name to this name, from this locus in history to this locus in history, from this text to this text, is the metaphor of metaphor is in some ways both contained within space-time travel as metaphor and as literalization, so that we're working across these physical materials. Now, I performed this all within this particular site, this particular blog on a set of pages, but one could easily reach, to other sites. Like I could more significantly reach out to, works of Nellie Bly, across different domains of space-time, for example, Roosevelt Island. So I'm not going there today, but we could, and we could bring the investigation of Bachman to other places as well, and we could perform across, multiple kinds of materialities, and textualities, and return, in more significant ways to mentions of, things like the stones that are a part of the metaphorical construction of Psalm 144, and how my reference to Orpheus and his harp in some ways has connections with the harp that David plays, and that that collection that I talked about is beginning with precious and semi-precious stolen stones, evolved into gatherings of non-precious stones that take on more ritualistic and in some sense performatively linguistic functions as prayers. One could, for example, type in the term gathering stones and my name on the internet and look for poetries and poetics that involve the narration of gathering stones and the acts of gathering stones, and how although that a collection of stones began as a critique of colonialism and capital, it led to a kind of almost spiritual work in the act of placing a stone as a form of prayer, and the performativity of prayer for certain types of changes and social becoming. So one could explore, all of those domains in terms of the metaphor and literalization of space-time travel as carriage across these coordinates as well.